We sometimes think about the crisis of sociology and the nature of the discipline in terms of the discipline. But what I want to do is try and ground our discipline within the institutional context of its expression. Not to depress you, I depressed John last night with a very bleak vision of the future of sociology. But just to be realistic about the kind of institutional constraints that we now face as academics, and perhaps just academics in the social sciences, I don't know. I'll raise some questions at the end. My paper is called Living with the H-Index, and if you don't know what the H-Index is, I'll explain, because you're going to have to know what the H-Index is very, very soon as fledgling academics. And the subtitle is Metric Assemblages in the Contemporary Academy. But what I want to talk about is how people are feeling in the academy. And I was struck by a paper by a friend of mine, Ros Gill, who works at King's College, in a book that she's edited recently called Secrecy and Silence in the Research Process. And in her chapter, she makes this claim. Many academics, she says, are exhausted, stressed, overloaded, suffering from insomnia, feeling anxious, experiencing feelings of shame, aggression, hurt, guilt, and out-of-placeness. And I think that's right. At least that's what people say. That's how they express themselves for the most part. One can observe it all around. I think a deep, affective, somatic crisis that threatens to overwhelm us all. And it's very important that it doesn't, I think. And I want to try and look at the roots of that expression of those feelings about what it means to be an academic. And I've put some little images there that I've just got off the web. And in a sense, given the theme of this conference, this little cartoon here seems to me to express something about public concern about our labour. This is a series of cartoons called The Academic versus Person from Anywhere Else. And the academic says, oh, we have this thing in academia called Publish or Perish. And the person from anywhere else says, oh yeah, we've got that, it's called Do Your Job or Get Fired. So the first thing I want to say is I think we need to get real about how important or how unimportant we are, and to be less precious than we are about the kinds of pressures that we confront. But we do need to identify what it is about our current circumstances working within the neoliberal academy that tends to invoke some of the feelings that Ros Gill gives expression to. Of course, it's an empirical question about whether those feelings are just located within sociology departments or whether they are actually located more broadly within the STEM subjects, within physics, within engineering, and so on. That's a question I'll come back to. But at the heart of what I want to talk about is the relationship between value and values. At the heart of this talk is the transformation of academic value. And this is a quote from a recent paper by Hermione Martins. Value and values. In the bygone world, he says, different kinds of institutions embodied various incommensurable kinds of value. Academic value was not to be identified with artistic value, nor artistic value with monetary value, and so on. But in our brave new world, it seems that a single final criteria of value is recognised, a quantitative economic criterion. All else is no more than a means, and there is a single method for ensuring that this criteria is satisfied: quantified control. And it's this notion of quantified control and the contemporary cultural importance of number and numbers that I want to talk about, and to reflect upon the impact of number and numbers within our own practices. Before I get into the meat of it, is Nick Gaines still here? Nick Gaines recently published a nice paper which really inspired me to put this paper together. And he offers in his new book, Max Weber Today, a really interesting, I think, interpretation of Foucault's lectures on the birth of biopolitics. And so Nick's reading of Foucault, drawing upon the kind of ordoliberalism of the Freiburg School of Political Economy, suggests that actually many popular accounts of neoliberalism is a misinterpretation of some of the processes that we might be interested in. That Foucault argues that our understanding of the relationship between the state and the market under neoliberalism isn't just about the state versus laissez-faire. That actually the state under neoliberalism has always been a competition state. That in fact a state under the supervision of the market rather than a market supervised by the state is the direction that we should move in. And the idea that increasingly the legitimacy of the state is not seen in terms of its statehood, it is in terms of the way in which it can mimic the market. Now, the discourses of privatisation are the beginnings of that, but it's actually about the state having a legitimacy over the market by self-marketising itself, by trying to take on the processes of the market internal to the state in order to gain legitimacy. And it got me thinking about, what we used to call the public sector, what we used to call those elements of the state, like the health service, like the police force, like local councils, like the academy, and to think about the inherent marketisation of those processes. And the role, in particular, of number and numbers within that process. And to think about, to try and periodise that, to think about when the moment of the metrics, as I'm going to call it, took hold. The moment of the metrics, when number and numbers came to define the value of our work, of our labour within the academy. And one can do that by going back through the history of higher education. But one can do it, I think, most effectively by looking at a particular genre, a genre I'm particularly fond of, which is the genre of the campus novel. Mm-hmm. And there's a wonderful book, which would be in my sort of top 10 of my favourite sociological texts, if ever anyone asked me to give the top 10. And that's a book by Ian Carter, who spent a little time at York, actually. Ended up as Professor of Sociology at the University of Auckland. Someone who used to like railways, used to write about the sociology of railways, but published a lovely book in the late 80s, early 90s, Ancient Cultures of Conceit, which is a sociology of British university fiction. And what you get in terms of reading this book about the post-war history of the academy and fictionalised accounts of the academy is the autonomy, the space, the kind of the nonsense of distinction and hierarchy that goes on within those institutions. But what you don't get is any sense of bureaucratic control or of measurement or of what I'm going to call the quantified control. It's of the bygone age. But soon after that book was published, if you follow what happened to campus fiction in the decade after that book was published, they are all concerned with what happens when a bureaucratic impulse, the impulse of the audit culture, begins to impinge upon the values of academic life. And the first book that I'd point towards is a book by a sociologist, died just a couple of months ago, Frank Parkin, who was I'd say an unsuccessful novelist, really. He wrote a couple of books, Krippendorf's Tribe, which was made into a very bad film. But then the second book, The Mind and Body Shop, which it wasn't really funny by the time it'd come out, because what he was talking about was already happening. He was talking about what happened to a philosophy department when it was asked to commercialise its activities and to demonstrate impact. And it's The Mind and Body Shop. But the second book I would point towards, when metrics begin to impinge upon fictional accounts of academic life, is Anne Oakley's fourth or fifth novel, Overheads, which is about many things, but is about a battle over something called truths, TRUs. The idea that the labour in the Polytechnic that she is working in could be made commensurate by actually trying to develop a metric, a measure, trying to equivalize teaching, research and academic activities within a common metric in terms of a workload model. And the publication of this book kind of coincides with the interest of anthropologists, Marilyn Strathern and others, in trying to look at the role of audit and look at the role of measure within the academy. So the moment of the metrics, we can probably trace it right back to somewhere about 1985 with various reports about kind of auditing processes in the academy and such like. But we managed to avoid it for many, many years. The moment when metrics began to take hold and have some purchase on our activities, on our lives, on how we actually orientate, I would date far more recently than that. I would say it happened sometime between the RAE in 2001 and the RAE in 2008, probably. Around about that point, a metric assemblage occurred that generated a bifurcation in terms of the academic life world. I'm interested in number and numbers. I recognise that different metrics operate at different scales, some at the level of the individual, some at the level of the department, some at the level of the school or the faculty, some at an institutional level, some at a national level, some at an international level. And all of these different measures are increasingly nested within each other in very, very complex ways. So if you just reflect upon your own activities as an academic or as a postdoc student or as a doctoral student, think about the different ways in which your activities can be measured. One could, for instance, have something called an H-index of X, and I'll explain what an H-index is in a moment. It tells you how often your work is cited. You might publish in journals with an average impact factor of a number, Y. If you lecture, you might have an undergraduate teaching load below the institutional norm. You might have a PhD supervision load that is about average. You could calculate how long it takes you on average to supervise your students, whether you take longer than 4 years or 5 years or whatever. You could have an annual grant income in the top quartile for the social sciences. You could work within an academic agglomeration with an RAE score that places it in the top 5, whatever that might mean. But you might receive module student evaluations in the lower quartile of distribution. They might not like your teaching, and they might tell you that, and they might give you a number. You might work within a school or a department which has poor NSS, National Student Survey, results, placing it in the bottom quartile for the subject nationally. You might teach a subject where only Z% of graduates are in graduate employment after 6 months, and they only earn an average of £18,500. You might work within a higher education institute that's ranked in the top 10 nationally in various commercially driven league tables, and within a top 80 globally, according to others. It's quite easy, I think, to sit down and generate a list of, I've said 100 there, I think something approaching about 120, 125 different measures that each academic is now subject to, whether at an individual level or an institutional level. This is what I mean by the metric assemblage. All of these different measures all have different histories, were designed for different purposes, but they are experienced as a common assemblage, something that we all confront. And what I'm interested in is the affective qualities of working towards number, of actually orientating towards these various measures of our activity, and to reflect about how we can manage that situation and how we might resist it. I'm going to take those 120 odd different measures and just look at broadly 6 different domains that we seem to be subject to measure. I want to begin by saying a little bit about citations, which is in a sense the most mundane of activities, citing the work of others. You know, those of you who teach first year students, getting people how to learn how to do the Harvard referencing system, that very process of demonstrating that you've read the work of others, that you're quoting the work of others and such like, how that's been used historically and is now being used in a very profound way to monetize, essentially, academic practice. But then I want to move on to look at what we call workload models, the way in which work is allocated at departmental level, and the kinds of technologies, the kinds of spreadsheets, the kinds of assumptions that are built into how we actually allocate the mundane activities of teaching, of researching, and of administering academic life, how that's occurred. I then want to talk about a parallel process called the transparent costing data, which the Treasury imposes upon the Academy, and which has huge consequences for the way in which we calculate the allocation of resource within our activities. Then want to look at research assessments and research assessment exercises and how those things impinge upon workaday life. Teaching quality assessments and commercial university league tables. I'm not going to go into any detail about these things, but just to give you a sense of the extent and the reach from an individual to an institutional to an international level of number and numbers in terms of our activity. And in a sense, I'm going to tell you what my conclusion is now. My conclusion is one that concurs with the work of DeAngelis and Harvey in a brilliant paper in Historical Materialism a couple of years ago about what's happening. which is what is happening is that in an era of, let's call it cognitive capitalism, capital has been struggling with how to generate value and measure in terms of our activities, and it's nearly cracked it. It's nearly cracked it through the deluge of digital data and through the metricization of our activities. It's able now, or it's at the cusp of being able to measure and to compare our practices. This is the quote that in a sense is my conclusion from that paper. Armies of economists, statisticians, management scientists, information specialists, accountants and others are engaged in a struggle to connect heterogeneous concrete human activities on the basis of equal quantities of human labour in the abstract. That is, to link work and capitalist value. There is now an attempt to reimpose the law of value through measuring immaterial labour in higher education in the UK. Socially necessary labour crimes of immaterial doings are emerging and are being driven down at the same time as heterogeneous concrete activities are being made commensurable. All of the things that we engage in our day-to-day activities are being measured, are being put on scales to invoke competition between us as individuals, between institutions, in preparedness for the neoliberal marketisation of higher education. Value and values. The values that we might hold dear academically operating within an institutional space that is increasingly subject to quantified control and the values of the market. So, what does this look like? Well, citations. Let's begin with citations, and this is why the paper is called Living with the H-Index, because it seems to me that increasingly our activities are being monitored on a real-time basis. Every time one publishes a paper, an article or a book and cites the work of others, it feeds into databases held by big organisations like Google, like Thomson Reuters, like Elsevier. And these citation practices are used not any longer to help us with the history of ideas or helping us to understand the web of knowledge such that ideas are disseminated, which was their original function, but actually to generate a proxy measure of how important that particular publication is. So citation scores and the metricisation of these scores are now the subject of a whole new discipline, a whole new journal, in fact, called scientometrics. People who study other people's studies and generate publications about devising complicated mathematical measures for measuring the influence of other people's work. Now, at the heart of this are a couple of numbers. One is something called the H-Index, which was only kind of devised about 5 or 6 years ago, but which in science and now in the sciences is coming to, in a sense, encapsulate within a number how influential a journal is, how influential a department is, how influential a particular individual is in relation to the number of times that their paper is cited. That means you haven't got to read it, you haven't got to make a kind of an aesthetic judgment about whether it's a good argument or whether it is actually a reasonable rendition of whatever it is that's being studied. You can look at a number. And you can look at a number now via Google. For those of you who look at Google Scholar, you can look yourself up and it will generate for you your individual H-Index. But not just for you, for your managers and for your people who are going to hire you as well. The public life of data becomes very, very important. So, this is me. And my most influential paper is a book in 1995 called Cyberspace, Cyberbodies, Cyberpunk. It's been cited by 377 people. It's a rubbish book. It's completely incomprehensible. It's got papers in there by Nick Land that you can't understand a word of. But somehow it was published at a particular period, 95, when there wasn't much on the internet, and it's become, I know, the kind of the common point of departure. You want a reference on cyberspace, I will put Featherstone and Burrows, even if I haven't really read it. But here you get the H-indices. These are the new numbers. This is the new kind of value of academic life. Essentially the H-index, which is defined very, very simply, refers to a number. And it refers to the number of papers or the number of outputs, as we call them now, that have been cited that number of times or more. So I've got a career H index of 32. That means I have 32 outputs which have been cited 32 times or more. Okay, so it tries to combine both quantity and quality in relation to that metric, in relation to that number. But what you can do with individual academics, you can also do with journals. You can calculate H indices for journals. So the American Journal of Sociology is top of the league on that measure. Has an H index, a 5-year H index, because they've only got data going back that time, of 37. Sociology, the BSA journal, has an H index of 25. That means that on average, articles published in that journal are cited 25 times or more. That's all it means. Very simple measure. But as we'll see, that measure is and variants of it are being used to recursively value activities in ways that are really very interesting and perhaps troubling. But move away from those kind of citation practices and look at workload models. The idea that as a head of department or a head of school, you have to allocate activities to people. And there are now software packages, there are spreadsheets, there are mechanisms by which you look at how many hours people teach, how many people they've got in their classes, how many PhD students they've got, how much grant income they've got, whether they're administratively competent or not. A whole range of activities that can go into various kind of weighting structures in order to try and generate transparent or not so transparent equity in terms of workload distributions, such that you begin to put colleagues in competition with each other. And there is a certain tyranny of transparency sometimes where people get annoyed that they've got more pebbles than someone else, or whatever the kind of common metric is that's trying to measure these teaching and research units in relation to workload models. Then we have the lovely track and FEC. Now track and FEC ask for exactly the same data as the workload model, essentially, but using a bunch of headings that mean something to the Treasury, not to anything within the academy. And every few months, any public institution, the staff have to fill in a spreadsheet which tells them how many hours you have done of 20 different activities. Now this is a hopeless metric, absolutely hopeless metric. And one of the reasons I think it's so kind of affecting is that everyone knows it's hopeless. Not just the person who has to fill it in, but the management of the institution, and everyone apart from the Treasury knows that it's rubbish. But it generates other metrics and other measures that is used to allocate FEC, full economic costs, that are then used to generate differential rates for estates and for other indirect costs, because it's something that is audited and approved by a major auditing company. So, you know, the whole idea that on the one hand you're dealing with workload models and then you have to do it again in another parallel universe to generate something that feeds into an algorithm that you are unaware of again. And then there's this thing. If you get 4 or 5 academics in a room, 5 minutes they'll start talking about the REF or the RAE or the latest iteration of it. The idea that we're now moving towards a 2014 REF, it just feels to me that we've only finished the 2008 one. And what are we concerned about? Not with the real value of sociology, not with what the research is really trying to do or how good it might be under some kind of value criteria, but whether someone in a room, and some of you in the room will be making these judgments, think a paper is worth 1, 2, 3 or 4 stars. That's as banal as that. The idea that, as Les says, whether you should spend time, in terms of your workload allocation, going into a school and actually trying to encourage students to engage in really interesting sociological activity, or whether financially and professionally you would be better off staying at home and writing a paper to get it published in one of these other journals, in a high index journal that might be valued a 4 or a 3, which will generate income, which will mean that you have a lower staff-student ratio than you might otherwise do. So you get these kind of flows and these counter-flows. But the REF is interesting in its enactment, not just in terms of the publications that are required, but in terms of the narratives, the stabilisation, the performativity of those activities, and the wish fulfillment, the dream of what the submission might look like, what kind of hires you might make strategically, who you will include and who you will exclude in terms of those judgments. Then we have the NSS, the National Student Survey, and we have module evaluations, and we have online Web 2.0 applications like Rate My Professor, such that our activities of teachers, our activities of how we perform in the classroom are themselves rated. And they are affecting as well. It's not just the NSS score, which of course then, as we'll see in a moment, becomes public and is used to inform the decisions that students and their parents might make. For those of you who've just started teaching, you might also have got your first set of student feedback forms, which can be, despite having done this for years, can be really, really upsetting. People who don't like your shoes. People I had last year complaining that I was always on my mobile phone during the lecture, where in fact I was actually taking notes on my iPhone about what they were talking about. It doesn't matter. But the whole notion that it was boring, that there was too much reading, it was hard, you know, and done in a way that is anonymised. But it's also metricised in that you get an average score that then feeds into a departmental league table that then goes to a board of studies, and if you're at the bottom, then you think, I'm not going to teach stats again next year, I'll teach a course on cultural theory, because that will, you know, those sorts of tensions become very, very important. And the juxtaposition there with my little cartoon of the authoritative male professor there in the bygone period, not that I'm defending that for one moment, but the reconstruction of us as people who are subject to the same kind of criteria as a hotel in TripAdvisor, or a website where a series of judgments are made on us as service sector workers, essentially changes notions of academic legitimacy and how we feel about ourselves. And of course then become important because all of these different metrics feed into other aggregations of those metrics which are proprietary and commercialised to put us in a rank order. And in a system where we're charging £9,000 a year, of course, that becomes very important in terms of all of these small activities coming in. So what do you do as a manager under these circumstances? You've got someone who's crap as a lecturer, you take them out of these kind of systems because you can't afford to actually deal with those poor NSS scores. You try and give them some kind of other activity to begin to manage. So it changes the nature of academic practice in amazing ways. And of course it all feeds into this, into these commercial proprietary league tables now run by Thomson Reuters, actually, who have been sucking up and buying up various kind of metricised systems, such that not only at a national level, but now at a global level, we can quite precisely, evidently, rank order institutions and departments in relation to proprietary metrics. We don't often know how these things are calculated, but they're based upon H indices, they're based upon student NSS results, they're based upon all of these activities, such that we can compare and contrast each institution, each department, and make some kind of judgment about their value and worth. That seems to me to be new and important, and it changes the nature of academic value and academic work. It changes the nature of the topics that you research, it changes the nature of the funding that you try and get, it changes what you teach, it changes a whole range of things about the contemporary academy driven by number and numbers. And what's worse, and I always put a little bit of wire in, to quote Omar Little, it's play or get played. It raises real issues, and it comes back to some of the papers that we were talking about before about what contemporary resistance might look like. How you resist those numbers and numbers. How you, in your academic practice, can avoid measure, and how you can work with colleagues to avoid being in competition with colleagues. Now, what I want to argue is that the emergence of a particular structure of feeling amongst academics in the last few years is closely associated with what I would see, and other people might disagree, with a shift away from the audit culture. This isn't just about the audit culture. We now have a technology, a metric assemblage, which is autonomous from the audit culture. What these measures do now is actually, they begin not just to supposedly ensure accountability, which is what audit was supposed to be about. Coming back to the debates about ordoliberalism and the nature of the state, they actually now give us a proxy, and something better than a proxy actually, for the enactment of markets. For the enactment of markets. We have measures, precise comparisons between Goldsmiths and York in terms of NSS scores, in terms of ref outcomes, in terms of a range of other things, which allow you to make a judgment, a hierarchical judgment about the value or worth of those different institutions. Different departments, different universities, different countries, different measures. We are subject to this process of quantified control, which is all about the enactment of markets through these complex metric assemblages. So in the neoliberal university, in the world of student fees and ever-greater competition for student numbers and research grants, we now have a measure. We have measures. And the encouragement in a neoliberal market system is for students and their parents and each other to use those measures to make judgments and to spend our money in ways that is rational in relation to these metric assemblages. Academic value is essentially becoming monetized, it seems to me. And as this happens, academic values become transformed. Now, is that the only reason why Rosgill claims that academics are feeling as they do? Well, I think that's part of the reason, because clearly, given the nature of the social sciences, given its critical edge, given its analysis of organisational forms, many of us might feel some political objection to these value transformations. We might not like the monetisation, the marketisation of what we do. But actually I think it's more subtle than that. And looking at the work on the social life of methods, looking at the applications of ideas from science and technology studies to sociological practice, you come across this idea of our enactment. And I think we feel as comfortable as we do because we enact these measures. And we don't know how not to enact these measures. We are fully implicated in the enactment of REF, of NSS. We don't know how to resist that. We don't know how to resist that. And a question for us, really, and it comes back to a question of the resistance of capitalist hegemony in terms of popular culture more generally, is, you know, they've got us in a very, very difficult situation here. We can critique it, we can be radicalised about it, we can think about all different kinds of individual ways of dealing with this onslaught of number. But actually, how do we subvert it? Can we subvert it? Should we subvert it? These are issues that I think talk to the future, not just of sociology, but of academic practice more generally. And I think it raises a whole series of kind of, for me, quite empirical questions, really, which I'll end with. And they might be questions for further discussion. Are metrics really experienced as oppressively as I've characterised them here? Do people feel a revulsion that their work can be marked as a 1, 2, 3 or 4? You know, given that we're supposed to be so subtle and so nuanced in our kind of theoretical concerns, is it really a 4, is it a 3? If so, what's the impact of that? What's the personal impact? What's the professional impact of those issues? And how are different metrics experienced differently? Do more proximate workload models in the department impinge more upon one's psyche than the H-index, for example? Because the tyranny of transparency means that you've got this comparability, and, you know, as an academic manager, the amount of time you spend in terms of dealing with people who are doing this much more than someone else, and someone else won't do this because they're, you know, it's an interesting empirical question. What are the particular and cumulative effects on person value and how you think about yourself and your career in relation to these numbers? Does it lead to a sense of permanent failure to live up to the idealised academic performing well on all fronts? You know, good teacher, good researcher, huge amounts of research grant income, and a nice person at the same time? Is that possible anymore? And how are responses and effects distributed? Do we know anything about that? They're almost certainly highly gendered, but are they likely to be linked to generational, ethnic, class, and other differences in terms of the impact that these numbers have? Does it vary by discipline? Are mathematicians quite happy with this? And philosophers not so happy, and people in English, you know, even madder than they were before? How do they vary by discipline, institutional type, and or location within the professional hierarchy? And crucially, and this is where I'll end, what are the wider effects on the academic division of labour, on careers, on the student experience, and crucially, on our own scholarship? And how should can we resist this penetration of number or number? And the paper was called that, Kiss My Feckin' Ass. KISS is the new key information set, which all of us will have to provide for each of our courses, which will give 20 separate data items, giving results from the NSS, which will give early salary, will give data on contact hours. FEC is full economic costs, and ACSS is one of these things. It's an academician of the social sciences. It's a kind of a professional mark. How should we as a profession, how should we as a kind of an aggregation of people engaged in critical social science deal with metricisation? My final point is, not only do we enact those metrics, but as a discipline, as a subject, we've also been involved in the historical development of those measures. You know, we devise scales, we devise measurement, we devise typologies, and actually we need to be fully aware of our involvement from the very start in these processes. PageRank, citation scores, begins with the sociology of science and technology studies. Begins with the whole idea that citations, in a sense, give you a measure of the centrality or the importance of a particular paper. So we shouldn't just think that these things are being done to us. We are actively engaged in enacting these processes. But how do we resist?